Hello, my name is Steve Pretty. I'm a musician, performer and composer from London, and welcome to my podcast, Steve Pretty on the Origin of the Pieces. This is the show that helps you to hear, understand and enjoy music in new ways. Hello everyone, it's lovely to be back in your musically curious ears again. Thank you for joining me once more, and I hope you enjoyed the last episode we did with Frances Raffel talking about Eurovision. She was our Eurovision entry back in, I think, 1994, something like that, and we had a great chat about Eurovision and musical theatre and everything in between, so do go back and check that out. We've got another really fascinating episode today with another absolutely stellar guest. You may have noticed that things are slightly different with the last couple of episodes, and from this point on, I think we're going to move to this new format, if you like, where rather than having 3 or 4 different things per show, I'm going to just be talking about one thing per episode, but they're hopefully going to be a little bit more regular, a little bit shorter maybe, but one thing per show. And each episode will be hopefully there'll be as much variety as there has been in the first 25 episodes, where I've had 2, 3, sometimes 4 different things going on per episode. There'll still be that huge variety of stuff, but spread out over individual episodes, if that makes sense. So yeah, if you're confused about what's going on, that's what's going on. Anyway, today I am very, very privileged to talk to one of the art world's most celebrated practitioners in the UK, Jeremy Deller. He won the Turner Prize some years ago, and he has put together this, almost 30 years ago, he put together this incredible project called Acid Brass, which is what we're talking about today. So I just want to fill you in a bit with some of the background before I hand over to Jeremy. And that is that Acid Brass was this project which involved a diagram, which he alludes to, where he connects the dots between acid house, this type of electronic music that became very, very big in the 1990s, and the traditional brass band movement. So he created this diagram, which is really fascinating, how it all spiders together, and the different connections that they all have. And then there was a live element as well. A lot of Jeremy's work involves live elements, and the live element for this was where he commissioned a brass band, a traditional British brass band from the north of England called Williams Fairy, fabulous traditional band who I've worked with via Hackney Colliery Band. We did a special for Sky Arts a few years ago, Christmas special, and Williams Fairy did it, and so did we, and it was really, really interesting working with them then. But it's a traditional northern sort of colliery style brass band and acid house, and there's that marriage between the two. And when I started Hackney Colliery Band, it was best part of 15 years ago, this project Acid Brass was a huge inspiration for us. This idea of taking the tradition of British brass band and doing something new with it, doing something quite radical with it in a way. And although Hackney Colliery Band is in no way a traditional British brass band in terms of the lineup and in terms of our background, we're mainly jazz players or from the rock scene or similar things. It's still got this kind of interesting juxtaposition at its core, I suppose. So it was a big inspiration. So it was a real privilege to meet Jeremy and also to be involved with this project. We're doing it live. It probably will be over by the time you listen to this, but if you catch this in time, it is happening on the 13th of June 2025. We're doing a live version at Earth in Hackney, which is where we launched Hackney Colliery Band's album back in the autumn, which is you may remember from back in the autumn. Yeah, fantastic venue in Hackney, really good venue for this, and it's going to be an absolutely incredible night. But we rehearsed it last week. The whole band got together, and a traditional brass band in the UK has got quite an unusual lineup of brass instruments, very different from an orchestra, certainly very different from a jazz big band or any pop horn sections or anything like that. We might dig into the instrumentation of those in future episodes, but for now it's just worth recapping that these traditional bands evolved around the kind of coal mining areas of the UK, and they were very much community bands, so people would have day jobs, often of course working in the mines or in other local industry, and then they would come together and make music at night. But meanwhile this was happening, the miners' strike and these parts of UK history in the 1980s and early 1990s, that was happening contemporaneously with an explosion of acid house music and raves and this kind of thing. And Jeremy, I think, was very astute to see these two things as connected in some really interesting ways. So we dig into that quite a lot. So that's the context for our chat. The interview's in two parts, so I'm going to play the first part now, and then I'm going to just do a little bit of an explainer between, because I just need to explain a few bits of terminology and that kind of thing. So, without further ado, let me hand over to Jeremy Deller backstage at Earth in Hackney. Thanks so much for chatting, and we're here doing this amazing project that you came up with 30 years ago.
Nearly 30 years ago.
Not quite, sorry. Not quite 30 years ago.
Yeah, 28.
And with something like that, it starts presumably from the idea, and the idea of bringing these two cultures together. I mean, was that an obvious match, those two cultures, or did you consider other things?
No, it was the only one I thought of that worked in terms of musically, but also as an idea. So
yeah.
If I can be pretentious, say conceptually.
Yeah.
They both worked because I knew it would sound great, and it would look great, and it would do something else as well. It would sort of make a comment on history and on music itself. So.
And what was it that, you talked about the connections, and, can we just expand on that a little bit?
Well, I think for me it was about the proximity between the end of the miners' strike and the beginning of this movement, as I would call it, a social movement. So for me those things were very closely connected in my mind, even in my timeline of British history as I saw it, as I lived it, in a sense, or witnessed it. Those things were like really close, like a couple of years between them. Mm-hmm. So for me, it was about making a connection between those two big moments, the end of something and then the beginning of something else, and how they may have been connected.
And is there a sense in which they're both acid house and like the brass band tradition are kind of folk music forms?
Up to a point. When I say the end of something, I mean the miners' strike. So the end of sort of manufacturing industry, or the end of that, of the unions system, basically the breaking of the mining unions and the defeat and what that meant for Britain. But going back to your question, it was a form of sort of communal music making, or music that's enjoyed communally. Makes sense when it's heard in public with people around it, as brass bands do. You often experience them outdoors. A lot of raves happened outdoors, and there's an anonymity. There's a big anonymity to that scene, and there sort of is with brass bands as well. You don't really know who the players are or the conductor even. It's just the group doing something, and it's often amateurs. All those things. I felt there's a lot of connections, and the north of England, all those sort of geographical connections as well. So I just felt it was the melancholy in the music and the rousing nature of it. All those ideas were sort of swilling around, really. And
class is a big part of it as well, right?
It's a big part of it, in the sense that it's part of everything you do in Britain. It's always there, and of course it's working class, industrial class music making, and then acid house music or electronic music seemed classless. I don't know if it really is or was, but it definitely was, as a scene, like most youth movements would have, if you think about them, they do come from sort of working class environments.
And also made on a lot of that stuff made on relatively, as with the brass band in some respects, like relatively inexpensive and accessible gear.
It was maybe a democratisation of music making that was was much needed in the way that punk was as well with guitars. This was with computers or with technology. So it was definitely another stage on from punk in terms of giving the means of production to the people.
And are you into acid house yourself? Like, were you going to those raves, or?
I didn't go to big raves. I was very interested in it. I was very curious about it, but most things I do, I come to them too late, but also I'm always on the fringes.
Yeah, right.
So I was observing it and watching it, and making connections maybe in my mind, and very early on I thought this is really unusual and important. So I'd like to think I identified very early the importance of it, but a bit later I got into going out a lot, which was great, and so I did experience it, but not in those very early sort of 87 to 88, 89 maybe.
The very sort of birth of it.
Yeah, I was aware of it, and weirdly I was in clubs that was playing it, but I didn't know what it was.
Yeah,
because they're playing other stuff around it. I would have heard it quite early on actually in clubs in sort of 86, 87, but these were different kinds of clubs. They were sort of mainly gay clubs were playing it, but not in the way it was played later to a bigger audience. Right.
And and I mean, and how much were you aware of the brass band, so like the other side of it?
Well, I think, I'm from London, so the brass band isn't something that's sort of in the blood, as it were, but any big public event, any sort of, that you went to, any church fete or whatever, or you go to, this weekend it's the Lambeth Country Fair, which I'm going to go to, which is amazing. Anything like that, there's always a brass band somewhere, isn't there? It's like, it almost denotes public event. It's like it's a root, it's a rock almost around which things move, and it's something that if you've got a brass band there, that means it's this kind of event, and it's a civic, free public event. That's what it means to me when you see that, and it's amateurs and it's local people playing music to other local people, often at varying skill levels, but it's still something that people do together, and you kind of appreciate that. So for me, it was always something that I'd appreciate. And I saw a documentary, and they were using brass band music in it in the 90s, and they were playing cover versions of Queen songs, and there's this amazing version of Bohemian Rhapsody. I remember it really clearly, thinking, God, that's amazing. That's actually better than the original. That's sort of sadder than the original is. So it was. I've always liked steel bands, brass bands. It's funny, isn't it? Because they've both got metals with them, and so it was. For me, it was obvious to work with one. I've always wanted. I like working with musicians. It's the first time I'd worked with a group of musicians, so I was quite wary, quite worried. Talking to them about the kind of music, because it had such a bad reputation. But I just said contemporary electronic music.
Nice, right? You didn't specifically mention.
No,
because it was in the tabloids and stuff, I guess, wasn't
exactly,
it? People dying
but it's
at raves.
pre-internet in a way, so no one would have gone online and looked up acid house in 1996 when I approached the band, because there wouldn't have been any. Well, there might have been. Who knows? So, but I just thought, I just don't want to sort of muck this up at the first go when I speak to the manager. I'll just say that, because it is contemporary electronic music, and see what he says. And he said, well, we'll give it a go once and see what happens.
And here we are.
Which is all you want, really. Someone say yes. It's all, the power of that word. It's amazing.
Yeah, of course. Well, speaking of which, we've got to get back to
rehearsal.
Yeah,
part
and then we'll talk with part 2 in a bit, yeah.
All right.
Lovely, thanks. So that first bit of the interview, as I say, was just grabbed during a quick break in the rehearsal, and I managed to sit down with Jeremy for a bit longer afterwards and have a bit more of an in-depth interview with him then. But before I play that second bit of the interview, it's probably just worth explaining some of the things that we talk about, because one of the things we refer to is a 303. Now this is something called, I think it's TB-303 by a company called Roland from Japan. And this was at the time a relatively cheap synthesizer that was made, I think we talk about it in the interview, but I think it was sort of to accompany musicians playing in hotel lobbies and things, which is quite a funny thing to think about now, because I'm going to play you what it sounds like. Now, I don't have a 303, even though they're originally made to be cheap and affordable for musicians. They're not so affordable now. They go for very, very high prices, because they essentially created an entire genre. They created acid house. But I do have a virtual 303 on my computer, and that sounds a bit like this. So it's if I just get this up. By the way, if you can watch this as well. There's video of this. If you're on Spotify or on YouTube, you can see me playing this, and I'm going to play some clips of the band shortly, and you can see that too. Anyway, this is what it sounds like. So that's a sequence of notes. And you can hear it's got this very squelchy, quite aggressive sound. And if you think you stick a drum beat with that, and essentially you've got acid house, And so you can play it individually as well. It's quite funny to think that this was maybe designed, for hotel lobbies. It's quite aggressive hotel lobby sound. Anyway, so that's the 303, the TB-303, which, and again, I find it fascinating how one piece of gear can just create a whole genre, and it's something we'll probably come back to a lot over the coming episodes when we talk about other things like drum machines or synthesizers, or of course conventional acoustic instruments as well. It's the creation of a new piece of music technology is what creates a new genre of music or a new way of thinking about music. So it's a thread that runs through a lot of this podcast, that idea. Anyway, we're going to now, I just wanted to contrast that sound, so that very squelchy, kind of aggressive sound, with the sound of a traditional brass band. Now, this is from the recording of the Earth rehearsal for Acid Brass last week. So it is ironically playing acid house, albeit a very mellow intro to acid house. But you can just really hear how sonically different it is. So here is the band for acid house playing a bit of mellow acid house. So then it kicks off a bit. So that's the sound of a traditional brass band versus the sound of a 303. Pretty different sounds, and I think that's where Jeremy's vision in putting these things together has been so fascinating. So I'm going to play this interview with Jeremy. Before I do, though, just to say that if you are listening to this in time, there are still tickets for Acid Brass at Hackney in Earth, at the venue called Earth, a fantastic venue. So do roll up for that. There's also a brilliant after party with another electronic music pioneer, a guy called Gerald, which is going to be going on late. So do come and join us to have a little party afterwards. It's going to be a lot of fun. So yeah, thank you very much for having me along to the Acid House thing. I should actually say it was Jack Jones who runs this brilliant thing called the Listening Project, which is a great contemporary classical music and associated genres kind of night that he puts on in different venues and with different fascinating different projects, which I highly recommend. So do check out Jack's work with the Listening Project, amongst other things. But anyway, I'm going to hand over to my interview with Jeremy now, and then at the end I'm going to play us out with a piece from that rehearsal that you can hear at this gig if you're listening in time, or otherwise if you do miss the gig, I appreciate this is probably coming out pretty much the day of the gig, so if you missed the gig, do go and check out the record, the original record by Williams Fairy Band, Acid Brass. Do go and check that out. Anyway, over to Jeremy.
It's Acid Brass is what it says. It's a brass band playing acid house music. Mm-hmm. Having said that, the music isn't strictly acid house. It's sort of house music, dance music from that time.
And what distinguishes house from acid house?
It's basically a piece of technology called a 303. Mm-hmm. It's just one thing that makes a very specific sound.
It's that very squelchy bass sound, isn't it?
Very unusual bass sound. Roland made it to accompany people playing guitar. And it was meant to just put out bass lines, but you can do all these things with it. And it was a bit unruly, I think, to work with in a traditional setting, in a sort of hotel lobby setting. And it actually was much better used as something that was a kind of wilder sound, really, but it's rhythmic as well as not just bass notes, but it's very rhythmic and So
it really cuts through, doesn't it, as well, the 303? It's got a very particular tone to it, which is sort of funny to think of it accompanying someone playing in a hotel lobby, because it's
almost got a life of its own when you play one. All these sounds come up and you're really not sure why you're getting it and what you're doing. I mean, I'm not when I do it, but I'm sure it's the case when people got them.
Mm-hmm.
They're probably sold off cheap, weren't they, because they weren't that popular for what they're doing, and so you could pick one up for not much, and then you realise actually this is incredible.
I think that's what happened, and that's exactly. I mean, now they go for a fortune, but because of acid house, I guess. But back at the time, I think they were kind of considered slightly cheap and
like a failed instrument.
Yeah,
for what it was meant to be used for, but then it gets picked up.
Well, I find that endlessly fascinating with music, where genres are basically born out of bits of technology, and often those bits of technology are to do with constraints. They can do to do with, it was the cheapest thing we could find, or so much of that. Even in the 80s, a lot of the pop that was coming out of this country, or I suppose even in the 60s, was us trying to imitate American soul music.
Yeah. So you end up with someone like Joe Meek in his studio recreating the Wall of Sound, but sort of flat on the Holloway Road.
Yeah, exactly. So you are an artist, obviously, but so what was it that initially brought you to this project within your practice?
Well, it was the idea, obviously. But it was that idea of working with musicians, but also making a point about something, about history, but in an enjoyable way, and a sort of slightly absurd way as well. I like the absurdity of it and the humour within it. That was very important. And
so, because it feels like a bit of a political piece as well. There's
the diagram of obviously the diagram is really important that goes with it, called the History of the World, and it was basically trying to connect these two movements and how they connected musically, socially, politically, geographically, and so that anthropologically almost. So that was really important. The diagram is the most came into my head when the idea happened. It was like fully formed, really.
The diagram is fully formed in your head?
Yeah.
Interesting.
That came before the performance. I wrote out before a note had been performed.
Right. And what was how did you reach out? Did you choose fairies at random, or
pre-internet? Well, for me it was definitely pre-internet. It's pre-email even. When I rang Brass Band World.
Did you?
This rather staid magazine.
Yes.
And I spoke to the editor and I said, I'm looking for a band that's up for doing something a bit different. He said, ring Fairies, because the manager there might be up for it.
Right.
John. And so I rang them and said, like I said, contemporary electronic music, a performance in Liverpool, I had a date, and they said, yeah, all right. You need an arranger, we have an arranger, so he did it. They had one rehearsal, and then they did it.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
So like we're doing here, one rehearsal.
It's all very quick, yeah.
Right. Interesting.
Bill Drummond came with me from the KLF to see. He was interested in it. So they had a bit of a celeb almost in the room.
That's great.
I think he came to the rehearsal. He came at one point. I know he came at one point.
That's cool.
So he took a lot of interest in it.
Was there much resistance from the band, or from? I mean, you said that you were recommended them as a kind of some people who might be up for doing something unusual, but that world can be quite conventional and traditional.
It's quite a conservative world, I think. It's very competitive. But if you've got the right manager, someone who's got a bit of ambition for the band, then you get these opportunities. Obviously, with a lot of bands, the manager would have said, no, thank you. We've got a carol concert to do, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But John said, yeah, let's just see. So it's really about the manager, because they sort of dictate, I think, really who does what, and they respected him. And so it was a really easy relationship doing it. It was so straightforward. And it really taught me a lot, that working with the public and with people, groups of people, musicians or whoever, it's actually not that difficult if you approach them with the right idea at the right time. Yeah,
I guess it's going and feeling sort of open to a collaboration, essentially. I mean,
exactly, because I can't play an instrument. I can just about read music, sort of, and but I knew what I wanted. I was very clear about what I wanted. So for me, it was really important to get it right. But It was 80% them.
Well, it's interesting. We've just been rehearsing this afternoon ahead of the show, and when you were here this afternoon, again, it's clear that you've got a very definite idea what you want, but I guess it's all part of the collaboration with the original arranger and Kai, who's
and we did a performance before, and we changed the scores quite a bit because there's a lot of sort of dropouts in them and strange anomalies. So we've done a bit of smoothing out before. That happened last year, I think, whenever it was, the performance last year. So the scores are in a better shape than they were. For some reason, there's some strange sort of things that happened to them. I don't know what, glitches almost. So we did quite a lot of work on it already. So today, for me, it was really about the percussion. And I can't bear to see percussionists just standing around when the band's playing. Someone's just standing. It's like everyone should be playing. Really, that's my view.
Well, it's very interesting. So a lot of the band today come from more of that classical, traditional brass banding world. That's not really my background. I'm more of a jazz player, so I'm sort of slightly out on a limb. But what's really interesting about it is, especially from a percussion point of view, because this world, is so much about reading the parts and the dots. It's an interesting kind of contrast between what I would think of as more of a kind of groove-based music. So people, jazz, rock, hip hop, anything, where the dots, the rhythm music is a kind of guide, but is not
exactly. It's just in case you need it. So there was moments today when there were solos, and afterwards I went up to the players and said, look, just don't look at the music. You should just be out enjoying it and doing something, freaking out a bit. That's why I look at it.
But I suppose what that speaks to is like a bigger contrast between those things, right? Because acid house is in some sense a kind of punk aesthetic, isn't it?
In terms of production,
I mean, not in terms of the sonics, but in terms of the way it's approached. It's sort of done with these cheap things. It's done on a shoestring, not worrying about conventional music theory.
Sort of, and bypassing the industry as well, which is interesting. Music industry, doing it, the do-it-yourself thing, making a tape and then playing it out or whatever. So also the harshness of the sound. They're quite crude sounding, some of them. So that's a sort of punky thing as well. But it's just going along with that in a way, and just you're playing dance music effectively. So the percussion have quite a big role to play in that, obviously, to sort of get people excited.
I'm really interested in the different roles that music has and the different sort of functions, if you like, because I think it can do so many different things. Music, and one of the things that strikes me as really interesting about this project is that it's playing with those roles in quite a particular way, because a convention where brass bands were at, certainly when you approached Fairies, was not. I mean, I suppose they sometimes would play for dancing, but it's much more. There's a sort of sit-down concert, bandstand kind of thing.
It's sedentary, I would say. I mean, the bands march occasionally, don't they?
Yes, that's true.
With Friday is the big one, but there is a marching tradition. But that's not dancing.
No,
but it's movement at least. But brass band concert is meant to be quite sort of almost soporific in some places or some ways, where this isn't.
Yeah, exactly. And whereas acid house is about movement, is about dancing.
The absolute opposite.
Exactly.
Also, I mean, I've told this story a million times, but the first time I saw Fairies play, the second time I saw them play was in Birmingham at this beautiful concert hall. And I was watching the play, and there was literally in the front row there was someone doing their knitting. An old lady doing their knitting. And I just thought, wow, that's pretty intense to look at that.
Wow.
To be a young player and that's on the front row.
Yeah, someone's knitting on the front row.
It's hardly rock and roll, is it?
It's not very rock and roll.
So I just thought, well, I can do better than that. I'd like to think I can do better than that. But having said that, the first performance they did at Lipper was about half full. And I think most of the people went there not knowing what it was, and a lot probably went there thinking, oh, this is just a piss take, and it's going to be, like a laugh. And the band walked on, and they shuffled on. I mean, they looked so embarrassed to walk on, because they had no idea what was going to happen to them, and they looked really embarrassed. But then, as soon as they played the first song, you could tell everyone was like, wow, this is amazing. I mean, this sounds great. And it totally changed the atmosphere, and people were like cheering after the first track, and then they all sort of sat up and just thought, oh, it's not a setup, this is a real thing. So that was good.
So do you think that there was some suspicion amongst some of the band that it was a sort of pisstake, it was a sort of art prank?
Well, something. It wasn't. It was just. I think it's just looking at a young audience, which people never seen before, who were sort of quizzical and thought, they're wearing their uniforms, so they probably got a bit of sort of smiling or laughter when they came on in these uniforms, and so they were probably slightly concerned that this wasn't. These are two worlds that were not going to get on. But we had Tony Wilson, actually. This is not spoke about so much, from Factory Records. He was the MC, and he was brilliant.
Oh, was he?
Yeah, and he sort of spoke about every track and was like very interesting, talking about industry and leisure. The end of the industry and the beginning of leisure industry, and all that. So he gave it a really great context. Because that context is quite important, I think, isn't it, to the piece, to sort of explaining. Because I mean, it exists in its own right, but that little bit of that context really helps. It maybe needed it then, maybe less now. I don't know. Yeah. I mean, we're not doing that again. Obviously, Tony Wilson's long gone, but I've told the conductor whose name I've forgotten. Kai. That he should have a microphone and he should say hello and just communicate with the audience. I think it's really important.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm a great believer in that.
And making that connection is really important. So he's going to do that.
It's good. Yeah, I mean, it's something with the Hackney Colliery Band, which was partly inspired by this and New Orleans bands and the kind of contrast between. So it's sort of looking at the New Orleans bands and thinking, I want to do a British version of that and not just a kind of pale imitation of New Orleans. Sort of think about the British brass tradition and try and inject some of the spirit of New Orleans without directly just copying that
pastiche.
Exactly. Yeah, that's why we've ended up doing Prodigy tunes and it's all original stuff these days. But but with that in mind, when we've actually had an interesting thing the other way round, and you were just talking about with the Lipper concert, where we get people sometimes, depending on where we're playing. Like we did a gig in Windsor last year, Windsor Festival, and I think probably about a third of the audience thought we were a traditional colliery band when they booked for. So they turned up expecting that.
Hack didn't give it
yes, yeah, or indeed any sort of reading the blurb or googling or anything would. But we start off our set with I play through a load of pedals, and it all gets a bit freaky deaky to start with.
Are you sat?
No, God, no. Sort of jumping around, and I play through guitar pedals, and it would make a big sort of wall of sound to start the show.
Wow.
And then we're off doing, essentially kind of dance music, but
right.
and so you can see people. It's sort of it's like they were expecting to be able to do their knitting, and then they're slightly shocked that.
Windsor. That's not surprising actually if you think about it.
Yeah, but I think it's almost speaks to the same thing. It's like different roles that music can play, and if you're turning up expecting one thing, it can be a bit of a shock to the system to have the opposite in either direction, I think. Anyway, we're not going to keep you much longer. I was just going to ask one thing, which is something I ask all my guests on the show, which is what's the point of music?
The point of it? Well, it's a kind of form of communication, isn't it? I think that's without having to use words. In its purest sense. I mean, obviously, if you're singing a song, you're using words or a choir or whatever. But I think it's to communicate with other human beings. If you're playing in the same group as them or band or whatever, but also people out there. It's a way of talking to people.
It's a different mode of communication, and in terms
on a higher level, maybe,
or on a sort of more direct level,
spiritual or something. I don't know. It's to make connections.
That was sort of unmitigated by language, like by words.
It kind of brings people together, and it's a space. It's a good space to meet people and be around people.
And in terms of your art. Music has obviously played a role in this piece. Does it play a role in your other work?
Lots of my work has music within it. I've worked with steel bands. I've made a couple of films about music. Made pop videos. I've done all sorts of things. It's always going to be there.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's relatively is it relatively unusual in the art world to be working sort of directly with music? I
don't know. I've lost touch with the art world, to be honest. I'm sure everyone wants to work with music, don't they? Because all artists are frustrated musicians, and all musicians are frustrated artists. I think it's an exaggeration, but
no, it's true. I think it's
I know, you know, a lot of musicians went to art college.
Yeah.
So,
well, listen, thanks so much, and this is going to be a really fun show. And thanks for the amazing project. Okay, it's going to fade this down. So that is Acid Brass in Rehearsal last week. I think you'll agree, quite a sound like no other really, a really unusual combination of acid house and brass band. I'm going to round things off, I think, by playing this out, but just a huge thank you once again to Jeremy Deller and to Jack Jones and everyone involved with the Acid Brass, all the fantastic musicians you can hopefully hear if you get tickets in time. But meanwhile, thank you so much for listening. I'm hopefully, as I say, going to be back a little bit sooner in these more bite-sized chunks, so do stay tuned. Meanwhile, there's going to be lots of footage from rehearsals and from the gig up on my Patreon, so if you want to check out a bit more of this Acid Brass stuff, do go and sign up for Patreon. I'm aware patrons that I've been a little bit neglectful of you guys recently, so apologies for that, but lots more stuff coming your way very soon. Meanwhile, do sign up for the mailing list. That's completely free, loads of stuff coming up on there, and thank you to everyone involved, and I will be back in your musically curious ears very soon. See you later, bye.